Michael lay on the cold bathroom floor, shivering. His body curled up, his hands covering his ears, his heart pounding as if it were about to explode. But it wasn't bullets cutting through the air. It wasn't bombs shaking the ground. It was just the sound of fireworks in the neighborhood, celebrating the 4th of July. For anyone else on that quiet Houston street, it was a festive night. For Michael, it was confirmation that the war had never truly ended. Have you ever stopped to think about what happens when a soldier returns home? We see the emotional scenes at airports, the tight hugs, the tears of joy. But what happens next? What happens when the cameras turn off, when the family goes to sleep, when that man or woman is alone with their own thoughts for the first time in months? What nobody tells you is that for many war veterans, the hardest battle doesn't happen on the battlefield. It begins precisely when they set foot on American soil again, thinking the worst is over. Michael was 24 when he enlisted. He was an ordinary guy, a recent graduate, with that easy smile of someone who still believes the world makes sense. He had simple plans, marry Sarah, his girlfriend since high school, get a decent job, maybe have a couple of kids. But something inside him told him he needed to serve his country first, that he needed to make a difference. And that's exactly what he did. 18 months in Afghanistan, 18 months that would forever transform that young man from Houston into someone unrecognizable. Those were terrible months on that battlefield, days dragging themselves through the mud. Inside, trenches filled with water and mud, barbed wire, the bodies of comrades, a true hell on earth. Many casualties, much suffering until his return. Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover might surprise you, or perhaps even make you see someone close to you in a new light. When Michael finally returned home, he carried much more than just his backpack. He carried the weight of every explosion he witnessed, every scream he heard, every face he couldn't forget. 2 of his best friends from the platoon didn't return alive, and that's a debt no soldier knows how to repay. How do you go back to worrying about bills, traffic, what you're going to have for dinner, when part of you is still 11,000 kilometers away, trapped in a desert that won't leave your head? Sarah was waiting for him at the airport that October day. She held a handmade sign, her eyes shining with emotion. When she saw Michael descending the airplane stairs, she ran toward him as if nothing else in the world mattered. But when she hugged him, she felt something different. He was there, physically present, but it was like embracing a distant, almost ghostly version of the man she loved. Michael could barely return the hug. Not because he didn't want to, but because something inside him had disconnected. Have you ever felt that? Being in the right place, with the right people, but still feeling completely lost? In the days that followed, the family tried everything to make him feel at home. They prepared his favorite meals, gathered friends, and tried to resume their routine. But Michael wouldn't sleep. Or when he did sleep, he would wake up screaming, drenched in sweat, with the absolute certainty that he was under attack. During the day, any loud noise would put him on high alert, a door slamming, a car making noise in the street. The simple act of going to the supermarket became an ordeal because there were too many people, too much movement, too much open space where he felt vulnerable. And then came that first night, the night that would change everything. The night Michael finally understood that true hell hadn't been left behind. It had come along, hidden within his own mind. Sarah had gone out quickly to buy milk. "I'll be back in 15 minutes, she said, kissing his forehead. Michael nodded, trying to appear normal. But the moment he heard the door close, something began to tighten in his chest. And then the fireworks began. The first bang cut through the silence of the house like a rifle shot. Michael's body reacted before his mind could process it. One moment he was on the sofa trying to watch television. The next, he was on the bathroom floor, holding his breath, his heart pounding against his ribs with a violence that physically ached. Another bang. Then another, and another. To anyone in that quiet suburban Houston neighborhood, they were just fireworks celebrating the national holiday. To Michael, each explosion was a grenade. Each light that flickered by the window was an emergency signal. Every passing second was the absolute certainty that he was back in that desert, that the attack had begun again, that this time he wouldn't survive. He cowered in the corner between the toilet and the wall, his hands covering his head, trying to protect himself from a threat that only existed in his mind. But his brain didn't know that. To every fiber of his being, it was real. The danger was real. Death was imminent, and when Sarah returned 15 minutes later, she found the man she loved trembling uncontrollably, tears streaming down his face, unable to utter a single word. Do you know what's most terrifying about all this? Michael had returned from the war just 5 days before. 5 days in which he believed he was safe, that he had survived, that the worst was behind him. And that night, huddled on the cold bathroom floor, he finally understood the devastating truth. The war wasn't over. It never ends for those who truly lived through it. It just changes address, settles inside your head, and starts attacking at the most unexpected moments. If this topic resonates with you in any way, if you know someone who has gone through something similar, or if you simply understand the importance of talking about these invisible battles that so many people face, leave a comment below about what has impacted you the most so far. Share your story, or even just a word of support. Because look, this community we're building here isn't just about numbers or views. It's about creating a space where these stories can be told, where people like Michael, and there may be so many Michaels out there, feel that they are not alone. And if you're not yet subscribed to the channel, click the subscribe button now. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and reach more people with this kind of content that really matters. Every like, every comment, every share carries this message forward. It can reach someone who needs to hear exactly this today. So if it makes sense to you, help us spread this story. Because transformation begins when we stop pretending that certain pains don't exist. And Michael's pain that night was as real as the bombs he had faced on the other side of the world. Perhaps even more so, because at least there on the battlefield he knew who he was fighting. But how do you fight your own ghosts? How do you win a war that takes place inside your own head? Sarah held Michael that night until the tremors passed. She said nothing. She just held him, because sometimes there are no right words for a kind of pain that most people will never truly understand. In the following days, the situation only worsened. Michael stopped leaving the house. Any unexpected noise would send him into a panic. He barely spoke to Sarah, barely looked her in the eye. He started drinking to be able to sleep, but even then the nightmares came. They always came. And little by little, that 26-year-old who had returned from the war began to disappear completely, being replaced by a haunted man trapped between two worlds, not truly belonging to either of them. And it is precisely here that Michael's story takes an unexpected turn. Now, I want to delve even deeper into this subject because to understand the magnitude of the transformation Michael had to go through, we need to go back in time and know who he really was before all this happened. Because Michael wasn't born with these invisible scars. He wasn't always this haunted man trapped between two worlds. There was a time when Michael was just an ordinary young man, with ordinary dreams, living a life that any of us could recognize as normal. Michael grew up in Houston, Texas, in a quiet, middle-class neighborhood where everyone knew everyone. He played basketball with his friends on Saturday afternoons, helped his father fix the car in the garage, and had that kind of easy smile that lights up an entire room. At 18, he met Sarah in his senior year of high school chemistry class. She was sitting 2 rows ahead, with a notebook full of colorful notes and that focused look of someone who takes her studies seriously. Michael fell in love the moment she turned around and asked to borrow a pen, smiling in a way that made his heart race. They started dating 3 weeks later. And it was one of those teenage relationships that everyone thinks won't last. But it does. Because there was something genuine there, something solid. Michael and Sarah were best friends before they were boyfriend and girlfriend. They talked about everything, laughed at the same silly jokes, planned a future that seemed absolutely attainable. Nothing too grandiose, just a good, honest life with purpose. When Michael graduated from college at 24 with a business administration degree he could barely afford, with part-time jobs and hard work, he had a clear plan in mind. Get a decent job, save money for a couple of years, propose to Sarah, rent a small but comfortable apartment, and maybe have 2 children by the time he was 30. It was a simple dream. And precisely because it was simple, it was beautiful. It was real. It was achievable. But there was also something restless inside Michael. Something he couldn't quite name, but which nudged him during sleepless nights, in conversations with his World War II veteran grandfather, in news reports on television about American soldiers serving in distant places. Perhaps it was a sense of duty. Perhaps it was the need to prove something to himself. Perhaps it was simply that youthful and innocent desire to be part of something bigger, to serve his country, to be someone who truly matters. Sarah noticed the change, even before Michael said anything. One night, he took her to dinner at a small Italian restaurant they both loved, the kind of place with checkered tablecloths and candles on the tables. And in the middle of the conversation, between sips of soda, Michael let slip what he'd been thinking for weeks. He wanted to enlist. He wanted to serve in the armed forces. He felt he needed to do it before settling into an ordinary life. Sarah remained silent for what seemed like hours. Then she took his hand across the table and said something Michael would never forget. "I'll wait for you. No matter how long it takes, just promise me you'll come back." And Michael promised, with all the conviction of a 24-year-old who didn't yet truly understand the weight of promises impossible to keep. 3 months later, Michael was on a military plane bound for Afghanistan. And it was at that moment, watching Houston disappear through the window, that the first pang of doubt pierced his chest. Was he doing the right thing? Would Sarah really be waiting for him when he returned? Would he even return? Afghanistan was nothing like what Michael had imagined. Of course, he knew it wouldn't be easy, but theoretical knowledge never prepares anyone for the stark reality of being in a combat zone. The heat was suffocating, the kind of heat that sucks all the energy from your body and leaves you exhausted just from breathing. Dust got everywhere, in his eyes, his mouth, his lungs, making each breath feel like sandpaper going down his throat. And the fear. Oh, the fear was a constant presence, an invisible weight that Michael carried on his back, along with his 40-kilogram backpack. The first few months were the hardest. Michael was still trying to adjust, learning to sleep, even with the noise of helicopters flying overhead, learning not to overthink what could happen at any moment. He quickly made friends in the platoon. There was Marcus, a guy from Tennessee with a dry sense of humor who could elicit laughter even in the tensest situations. There was David from Ohio, quiet but loyal, the kind of person you trust with your life, without hesitation. And there was Jake, the sergeant, a veteran of 2 previous missions who led with firmness but also with genuine compassion for the men under his command. They became more than just work colleagues. They became brothers, because when you live in constant danger, when your survival depends on the person by your side, a kind of bond is created that no ordinary friendship can replicate. Michael trusted them with his life, and they trusted him in the same way. The missions were always tense. Patrols in villages where every door, every window, every corner could hide a threat. Convoys crossing roads where improvised explosives could be buried anywhere. Nights on guard duty where the slightest noise would make Michael's finger move closer to the trigger, his heart racing, all his senses on high alert. And then There were the real combats, those chaotic moments where training takes over and you do what needs to be done, without thinking, just reacting, surviving. Each explosion stole a piece of the person Michael was. Each wounded comrade, each civilian caught in the crossfire, each impossible decision he had to make in fractions of a second. All of this accumulated, layer upon layer, building a wall between the Michael who boarded that plane full of hope and idealism and the Michael he was becoming, hardened, exhausted, changed in ways he himself could not yet fully comprehend. The night he lost Marcus happened in the 10th month of his mission. It was an ambush during a routine patrol, the kind of situation that starts out normal and turns into a nightmare in a matter of seconds. Michael still remembers the sound of the explosion, Marcus's scream, running to him and seeing that there was nothing he could do. Marcus died there, on that dusty road thousands of kilometers from home, and Michael held his hand until the end, whispering that everything would be all right, even knowing it was a lie. David died 5 weeks later. Another patrol, another day that should have been like any other. And this time, Michael wasn't even around when it happened. He only heard the news on the radio, and something inside him broke. Not dramatically or noisily, it just broke, like glass cracking silently, a thin line of destruction that would continue to spread over the following months. The nights became impossible. Michael barely slept, and when he did, the nightmares came. Always the same faces, the same explosions, the same screams. He began to feel as if he were moving on autopilot, doing what needed to be done, completing missions, but without truly being present. It was as if the part of him that felt, that cared, that dreamed, had been switched off so that the part that needed to survive could take over. Jake noticed the change. One night after a particularly difficult mission, he sat next to Michael and said something simple but profound. What you're feeling now, this numbness, this emptiness, is your brain trying to protect you. But don't let it become permanent, kid. Because if you do, you won't come back. At the time, Michael just nodded, not really understanding the weight of those words. He would only understand months later, when it was almost too late. The last 3 months of the mission were the longest. Michael counted the days, the hours, like a prisoner marking time on the wall of a cell. He still did his job, still protected his comrades, still carried out every order. But inside he was empty, exhausted in a way that went far beyond physical fatigue. It was an exhaustion of the soul, a kind of burnout that no amount of sleep could cure. When he finally received the news that he was coming home, Michael felt a mixture of relief and something strange, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. It was almost like fear. Fear that he had changed so much that he wouldn't be able to fit back into the life he left behind. Fear that Houston, Sarah, everything he loved now seemed too small, too distant, too unreal. But the real hell was yet to come, and Michael had no idea. The flight back to the United States was long and silent. Michael stared out the window, watching Afghanistan disappear below the clouds, and wondered if that feeling of being trapped between two worlds would go away when he set foot on American soil. Spoiler alert, it didn't. In fact, it only got worse. When the plane landed on American soil, there were cheers and shouts of joy from the other soldiers. Michael forced a smile, clapped along with everyone, but inside he felt only a strange emptiness. It was as if he were watching everything from outside his own body, seeing that moment that should have been one of pure happiness, but which to him seemed somewhat unreal, somewhat distant. Sarah was at the Houston airport, exactly as she had promised. She held a sign with his name written in colorful letters, and when she saw him, her face lit up with that smile that Michael had carried in his memory for 18 whole months. She ran to him, threw her arms around his neck, and Michael smelled her perfume, that same perfume as always, and for a brief second everything seemed right. For a brief second, he thought that maybe he could go back to being who he was. But when he tried to hug her back, his arms felt heavy, mechanical. It was as if he had forgotten how to do it, how to be intimate, how to be vulnerable, how to simply be present with someone he loved. Sarah noticed his hesitation but said nothing. She just held his face in her hands and whispered, "You're home now. Everything is all right." But everything was not all right. And in the days that followed, this would become painfully clear. Michael's family prepared a welcome party. There were decorations, there was food, there were all the friends and relatives wanting to hug him, ask questions, hear stories, and Michael tried. He really tried to participate, to smile, to tell some safe anecdotes about life on the base. But every question about Afghanistan made his stomach churn. Every sound of a child screaming or a door slamming made his body instantly tense. After 2 hours of partying, Michael made up an excuse about being tired from the trip and locked himself in his room. Sarah found him sitting on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands. She sat beside him, placed her hand on his back, and gently asked if he wanted to talk. Michael just shook his head, not because he didn't want to, but because he didn't know where to begin. He didn't know how to put into words what he was feeling. He didn't know how to explain that it was as if he had returned to his body, but his mind was still 11,000 kilometers away. The first few weeks were a confusing sequence of failed attempts to return to normalcy. Michael tried to look for a job, but the interviews were a nightmare. Sitting in closed rooms, answering questions about career goals and interpersonal skills, it all seemed absurdly irrelevant compared to what he had been through. How do you care about sales projections when 3 months ago you were trying to keep your friends alive? Sleep was impossible. Michael lay in bed next to Sarah, listening to her quiet breathing, and felt a bitter envy at how she could simply close her eyes and sleep. For him, closing his eyes meant seeing it all again, reliving it all. So he spent hours staring at the ceiling, waiting for exhaustion to win. But when he finally fell asleep, the nightmares came with full force. He would wake up screaming, drenched in sweat, his heart pounding so hard it hurt. Sarah would wake up startled, trying to calm him down, but Michael could barely explain what he had seen, what he had felt. How do you explain that you dreamed you were back on that road, that you saw Marcus die again, that this time it was you who died, that you woke up with the absolute certainty that you were dead? During the day, anything could trigger a reaction. The sound of a truck reversing, the smell of something burning, a helicopter flying overhead. 1 second Michael was there, present, trying to have a normal conversation. The next second, he was back in Afghanistan, his whole body tense, his brain in survival mode, looking for threats that didn't exist. The family didn't understand. His father tried to give him well-intentioned but completely useless advice about getting over it and moving on. His mother would look at him with those eyes full of worry and pity, which somehow made it even worse. His friends stopped inviting him out because Michael always made excuses, or when he did go, he would stay quietly in the corner, visibly uncomfortable, leaving early. And the question everyone asked, that damned question Michael heard at least once a day, why don't you go back to being who you were? As if it were a choice, as if he could simply decide to erase the last 18 months and go back to being that 24-year-old boy who boarded that plane full of simple dreams. That person no longer existed. He had died somewhere between the first explosion and the last, between Marcus and David, between who Michael was and who he had become. Sarah was the only one who didn't pressure him. She was simply there, constant, patient, even when Michael distanced himself, even when he responded with silence or anger. But even her patience was beginning to wear thin. How could it not? She had waited 18 months for the love of her life, and the man who returned was almost a stranger. He was physically present but emotionally absent. He slept beside her, but seemed to be millions of miles away. And then came that first night, the night Sarah had to rush out to buy milk because she'd forgotten it, and they'd need it for breakfast the next day. She kissed Michael's forehead, said she'd be back in 15 minutes, and Michael nodded, trying to seem normal, trying to convince himself that everything was all right, that he could be alone for 15 minutes without panicking. But the moment he heard the door close, a heavy silence fell over the house. A silence that felt alive, that seemed to be waiting for something. Michael tried to distract himself with the television, but he couldn't concentrate on anything on the screen. Everything seemed too artificial, too noisy, too distant. He went to the kitchen to get water, but when he turned on the tap, the sound of the running water seemed too loud in contrast to the silence of the house. And then it began. The first bursts of fireworks tore through the 4th of July night. Michael hadn't even realized it was a holiday. He hadn't paid attention to the calendar, the decorations that were starting to appear on the streets, the lively conversations about barbecues and celebrations. The first burst caught him completely off guard. His body reacted before his conscious brain could process what was happening. One instant, he was in the kitchen holding a glass of water. The next, he was crouched behind the counter, the glass shattered on the floor, his heart racing, every muscle tense, ready to fight or flee. Another bang, then another, and another. Michael's rational mind was trying to scream that it was just fireworks, that he was in Houston, that he was safe. But the primitive part of his brain, the part that had been trained and traumatized for the past 18 months, wouldn't listen. To that part of him, each explosion was a real threat. Each flashing light outside the window was a warning sign. Each passing second was further confirmation that he was under attack, that he needed to protect himself, that he was going to die. Michael crawled to the bathroom, the only place without windows. The only place where he couldn't see the flashing lights of the fireworks. He huddled in the corner between the toilet and the wall, his hands covering his head, trying to make himself smaller, less visible, less vulnerable. The explosions continued outside, and with each one, Michael's body shrank further. His breathing became more difficult. The certainty of death became more real. He found himself sweating profusely, trembling uncontrollably, tears streaming down his face uncontrollably. And the most terrifying part wasn't the panic itself, it was the absolute clarity with which he understood, for the first time since returning, a devastating truth. The worst part wasn't the war. The worst part was realizing that it had never let him go, that he had carried it back home, carefully packaged inside his own head, ready to strike at the most unexpected moments. When Sarah returned and found Michael in that state, she didn't ask questions. She didn't ask for explanations. She simply sat on the floor beside him, held him in her arms, and stayed there until the tremors subsided, until his breathing normalized, until the fireworks stopped. And even after they stopped, she continued holding him, because she knew that Michael needed to feel that someone was there, that he wasn't alone in that particular hell. That night marked a turning point, but not in the way you might imagine. It wasn't the moment when everything started to get better. It was the moment when everything truly began to fall apart. Because after that night, Michael could no longer pretend that he was okay, that he was adjusting, that everything would soon return to normal. The mask had fallen, and what remained was a completely lost man without the slightest idea of how to find his way back. In the months that followed, Michael plunged into a downward spiral that seemed endless. He finally landed a job at a logistics company, but it barely lasted 3 weeks before he was fired for excessive absenteeism. The mornings, when he simply couldn't get out of bed, had become too frequent. The times he arrived at work, only to have a panic attack mid-shift and had to rush out, didn't help either. Alcohol entered the equation as a temporary solution to the sleep problem. 2 beers became 4. 4 became 6. Eventually, Michael was drinking half a liter of whiskey a night just to be able to drift off long enough for what could generously be called sleep. Sarah begged him to stop, to seek help, but Michael ignored her. He was ashamed of needing help with something as basic as sleeping, ashamed of not being able to simply overcome it, ashamed of being weak, because that's how he saw the situation, as weakness. Jake was fine. Other guys in the squad were fine. Why couldn't he be strong like them? Why was he the only one who had come back broken? Of course, this logic was completely flawed, but depression and trauma don't operate within the limits of logic. They operate in the dark, whispering lies that seem like absolute truths when you're at rock bottom. Michael distanced himself from everyone. He stopped answering his parents' calls. He avoided leaving the house. He spent entire weeks without seeing anyone besides Sarah, and even with her, conversations became increasingly rare and superficial. He lived inside his own head, a prisoner of thoughts that spun in endless circles, always returning to the same scenes, the same unanswered questions, the same overwhelming guilt. Comment below. I understand this struggle, if any part of this journey makes sense to you. Survivor's guilt is one of the heaviest burdens a human being can carry. Michael felt he should have died instead of Marcus, or David, or any of the guys who didn't come back. Why had he survived? What was the point? These questions haunted him day and night, eroding any remaining peace that might have existed within him. There were times when Michael seriously considered giving up on everything. Times when he looked at the pill bottle in the bathroom cabinet and calculated how many he would need. Times when he drove down the road late at night and thought how easy it would be to just turn the steering wheel and end it all. Because how do you start over when you're trapped inside your own head? How do you find hope when each day feels like an impossible battle just to keep breathing? Sarah found him crying on the kitchen floor one Tuesday afternoon. It wasn't a dramatic cry. It was a silent, exhausted cry, the kind that comes from someone who no longer has the strength to fight. She sat beside him on the cold floor, and for the first time in months, Michael truly spoke. Not about fireworks or nightmares, but about guilt, about shame, about the constant fear that he would never be able to function again, about how he thought Sarah deserved someone better, someone whole, someone who wasn't so completely broken. Sarah listened to everything in silence. And when Michael finished, she said something simple, but that would change everything. You don't have to do this alone. Please, let me help you find real help. It wasn't an ultimatum, it wasn't pressure. It was a genuine plea from someone who loved him enough not to give up, even when everything seemed lost. The next morning, Sarah did some research and found a support group for veterans in Austin, about a 2-hour drive away. She scheduled it for the following Saturday. Michael didn't want to go. He frowned, complained, and made up every possible excuse. But Sarah wouldn't give in. And on Saturday morning, she practically dragged him into the car and drove to Austin. The group met in a small, somewhat run-down community center with plastic chairs arranged in a circle and bad coffee served in disposable cups. Michael entered with his arms crossed, his posture defensive, already decided that this would be a waste of time. There were about 15 people in the group, all veterans, all with that look that Michael recognized immediately, that look of someone who had seen things they couldn't forget. The facilitator was a man named Jake. Yes, the same Jake who had served with Michael. Jake was sitting in one of the chairs with a calm but attentive expression. And when he saw Michael enter, his eyes lit up with genuine recognition. After the session, Jake pulled Michael aside and they talked for almost an hour in the parking lot. Jake didn't give empty advice like, be strong or get over it. He truly spoke about his own journey, about how he returned from his first mission thinking he was okay, But on his second mission realized he wasn't. About how it took him years to seek help because he thought it meant being weak. About how finally accepting therapy and treatment had been the bravest decision he had ever made. And then Jake said something that Michael would carry with him for years to come. You're not going back to being who you were. That person died there, but you can become someone better, someone who understands pain, who knows darkness, but who chooses the light anyway. That was the first day Michael felt he wasn't alone, not in the superficial sense of having people around, but in the profound sense of being with people who truly understood, people who didn't look at him with pity or confusion. People who had been through the same hell and knew exactly what it was like. Michael started attending the group every week, and in the third session, Jake suggested he seek a therapist specializing in PTSD and war trauma. This time, Michael didn't resist. He was tired of fighting alone. He was tired of waking up every day feeling like he was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. He was ready to try anything that could bring even a little relief. Therapy wasn't magic. It wasn't like in the movies where you have a profound revelation and suddenly you're healed. It was difficult. It was painful. There were sessions where Michael left feeling worse than when he went in, because reliving the trauma to process it is one of the most brutal things you can do. But little by little, session after session, something began to change. The therapist taught Michael breathing techniques for when panic attacks began, grounding exercises for when he felt disconnected from reality, ways to identify triggers before they caught him completely off guard. And most importantly, the therapist helped Michael understand that what he was feeling was a normal response to abnormal trauma, that having PTSD didn't make him weak or irreparably broken. It made him human. Michael also took up running again. He used to love running before the war, but had completely abandoned it when he returned. One morning, without much thought, he put on an old pair of sneakers and went for a run. The first 5 minutes were awful. His legs were weak, his lungs burned, his whole body protested. But then something happened. The rhythm of his breathing, the sound of his feet hitting the asphalt, the feeling of the wind on his face. All of this created a moment of mental clarity that Michael hadn't felt in months. For 15 glorious minutes, his mind was quiet. And when he returned home, Sarah noticed something different in his eyes. Something she hadn't seen in a long time. Hope. Small victories began to accumulate. The first night Michael slept 6 hours straight without waking up screaming. The first time he heard fireworks and was able to consciously remember that he wasn't in danger, take a deep breath and let the moment pass without completely panicking. The first real, deep, vulnerable conversation he had with Sarah in months, where he finally managed to put into words what he was feeling without shutting down or deflecting. Michael began to accept that the pain was now a part of him, that the memories would never completely go away, that there would always be difficult days, unexpected triggers, moments of darkness. But he also began to understand that this didn't define him, that he could carry this pain and still live a life with purpose, with joy, with connection. Rebirth isn't about erasing the past. It's about learning to carry it in a different way. It's about understanding that scars are part of who you are, but they aren't everything you are. It's about choosing day after day, even in the most difficult moments, to keep trying. It was almost 2 years of therapy, support groups, good days and bad days, advances and setbacks. But little by little, Michael began to feel present again, not in the way he was before, but in a new way. A way that recognized the pain, but wasn't dominated by it. A way that understood the darkness, but chose the light. Sarah watched the transformation unfold gradually. The man who had returned from the war, distant and haunted, was slowly becoming a new person. Someone who carried scars, but also wisdom. Someone who knew pain, but also the profound compassion that comes from surviving the unbearable. And then, 3 years after that first terrible night on the bathroom floor, Michael did something he never imagined he would do. He volunteered at the same support group that had saved him. Jake greeted him with a tight hug and a smile that said it all, because helping other veterans find their way back wasn't just altruism on Michael's part. It was part of his own healing. It was transforming all that pain into purpose. It was using his journey to light the way for others who were lost in the same darkness. The first time Michael spoke to the group, his voice trembled. He told his story, from the bathroom floor to that moment. And he saw in the eyes of other veterans the same recognition he had seen in Jake's eyes years before. That look of, "You understand me. You really understand me." And in that moment, Michael realized he had found his purpose. Not the purpose he had imagined at 24, but a deeper purpose, forged in the fire of suffering and transformation. Michael and Sarah married in a small, intimate ceremony with only close family and friends from their support group. Jake was the best man. It was a simple but perfect day, filled with genuine love and the deep understanding that they had survived together, something that would have destroyed many relationships. Sarah had stayed. She had held on, even in the darkest moments. And Michael would never forget that loyalty, that strength, that unconditional love. He also opened a small carpentry business. Working with his hands, creating something physical and tangible had become a powerful way to stay in the present. Each piece of wood he transformed into a table, chair, or shelf was an affirmation that he could still build beautiful things, that his hands could create instead of just destroying. The workshop became his sanctuary, the place where his mind could finally be quiet, focused only on the sound of the sandpaper, the smell of the wood, the weight of the tool in his hand. Michael hadn't forgotten the war. The memories were still there, as vivid as ever. Marcus and David still appeared in his dreams from time to time. There were days when the weight of it all seemed unbearable, but the difference was that now Michael had the tools to cope with those moments. He had a support network, he had purpose, he had hope, and above all, he had a profound understanding that the war no longer controlled who he was. He had chosen to be more than his trauma. Today, when new veterans arrive at the support group with that lost and haunted look that Michael recognizes so well, he sits beside them and shares his story. Not to give false hope or empty promises that everything will be all right, but to show that transformation is possible, that you can be at rock bottom thinking you'll never get out, and yet, with help, with time, with brutal and honest effort, you can find your way back to the light. If Michael could do it, others can too. That's the message he carries now. Not that it's easy, not that it's quick, but that it is possible. It's always possible to choose to continue, to choose to fight, to choose to live, even when everything inside you is screaming to give up. Michael's story isn't just about war. It's about all the invisible battles people face every day. It's about the veteran who returns home with PTSD. It's about the person battling depression. It's about someone who lost a loved one and doesn't know how to go on. It's about anyone who has ever felt so broken that they thought they would never be able to get back on their feet. It's about what happens when you decide not to give up, even when everything seems lost, when you accept that you might need help, when you understand that asking for help isn't weakness, it's the bravest thing you can do, when you realize that transformation is possible, even in the most impossible situations. Because rebirth isn't about erasing scars. It never was. It's about choosing to live despite them. It's about understanding that you can be deeply wounded and still be strong, that you can carry pain and still create beauty, that you can know darkness and still choose the light day after day, moment after moment. Michael learned this the hard way, through pain, despair, and almost losing everything. But he learned, and now he uses this hard-won wisdom to help others find their own way. Because in the end, that's what gives meaning to suffering. Not that suffering itself has a purpose, but what you choose to do with it can. Every time Michael helps a veteran take that first step toward healing, every time he sees that light of hope ignite in the eyes of someone who thought they were lost forever, he feels that Marcus and David didn't die in vain, that all that pain, all that darkness, somehow transformed into something that can save lives. And if you've made it this far, to the end of this story, it's because something within it resonated with you. Maybe you know a veteran. Maybe you're going through your own invisible battle. Maybe you simply understand that behind every person, there's a story we don't know, a struggle we don't see. If this message touched you in any way, subscribe to the channel. We bring you stories like this every week, real stories of people who transformed pain into rebirth, darkness into light, despair into hope. And leave a comment writing, "This message was for me. I want to know that you were here, that you listened, that you understood." If this video resonated with you, please leave a like. Not for me, but because it helps the algorithm bring this story to more people who might need to hear exactly this today. Someone who's on the bathroom floor right now, trembling, thinking it will never get better. That person needs to know that there is hope on the other side. There's a video over here about how small decisions can completely change the course of a life. Click and continue watching, because these stories connect in ways you can't even imagine. Courage is not about not being afraid. It's about deciding to live even with fear.